his investigation, Rees found that many of the big foundations were funding groups and initiatives that promoted the communist ideology. In a speech before the 83rd Congress, Congressman Carroll Rees made his case against the big tax-exempt foundations.
Some of these activities and some of these institutions support efforts to overthrow our government and to undermine our American way of life. Here lies the story of how communism and socialism are financed in the United States, where they get their money. It is the story of who pays the bills. There is evidence to show there is a diabolical conspiracy to back all of this. Its aim is the furtherance of socialism in the United States. The examples I have given of the use of tax-exempt funds are just indications of the kind of problems which a committee of the 83rd Congress should thoroughly explore. These examples do not involve just a grant of a few $1,000s to a person who happens to be a communist, but involve giving millions of dollars for many years to pro-socialist and pro-communist propaganda projects that are vitally affecting our children in our schools and have a tremendous influence over the public mind. These foundations possessing huge sums of untaxed wealth seem to be dedicated to promoting specific views on matters such as the welfare state, the United Nations, American foreign policy, the nature of the American economy, and so on, rather than presenting objective and unbiased examination of these issues.
During the course of the investigation, it was found many organizations and initiatives funded by foundations like the Rockefeller Foundation, Ford Foundation, and the Carnage Endowment for International Peace were promoting socialism and communism, even though the founders of these foundations had made their fortunes in capitalist enterprises. Many of the administrators of these foundations were avowed communists or socialists, such as convicted spy Alger Hiss, who was president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace for 3 years until he was exposed as a Soviet agent. According to Norman Dodd, director of research on the Rees Committee, grants toward education, specifically by the Rockefeller Foundation and the Carnegie Foundation, were
directing education in the United States towards an international viewpoint and discrediting traditions to which the United States had formerly been dedicated.
In his report titled The Dodd Report, and in his testimony before Congress, Norman Dodd testified that
during the 4 years 1933 to 1936, a change took place which was so drastic to constitute a revolution. The committee also indicated conclusively that the responsibility for the economic welfare of the American people had been transferred heavily to the executive branch of the federal government, that a corresponding change in education had taken place from an impetus outside of the local community, and that this revolution had occurred without violence and with the full consent of an overwhelming majority of the electorate.
Willard E. Givens, an 18-year executive director at the National Education Association, on record in 1934 stated at the organization's 72nd meeting,
"A dying laissez-faire must be completely destroyed, and all of us, including the owners, must be subjected to a large amount of social control. A large section of our discussion group, accepting the conclusions of distinguished students, maintain that in our fragile, interdependent society, the credit agencies, the basic industries and utilities cannot be centrally planned under private ownership."
Director of Charity for the Rockefeller Foundation, Frederick T. Gates, who set up the General Education Board, stated the goals and philosophy of the foundation in regards to education in a report titled The County School of Tomorrow, Occasional Paper Number 1, published in 1913.
"Is there aught of remedy for this neglect of rural life? Let us at least yield ourselves to the gratifications of a beautiful dream that there is. In our dream, we have limitless resources, and the people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hand. The present educational conventions fade from our minds, and, unhampered by tradition, we work our own goodwill upon a grateful and responsive rural folk. We shall not try to make these people or any of their children into philosophers or men of learning or of science. We are not to raise up from among them authors, orators, poets, or men of letters. We shall not search for embryo great artists, painters, musicians, nor will we cherish even the humbler ambition to raise up from among them lawyers, doctors, preachers, politicians, statesmen, of whom we now have ample supply.
In a 1960 report commissioned by the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare titled Soviet Education Programs, Foundations, Curriculums, Teacher Preparation, in which the authors examined the Soviet education system, the same education system which American educators traveling back and forth from the Soviet Union were so enamored by a few decades earlier. The report stated,
"The ideas and practices of Soviet education form a philosophy of education in which the authoritarian concept predominates. Major efforts of USSR schools during the past 30 years have been to train youngsters for the government's planned economic programs and to inculcate devotion to its political and social system. Soviet patriotism, fidelity to the Soviet land and to the idea of communism, occupies a leading place in this educational conditioning, and in this sense gives the school a political character as well as a moral one. Employing primarily the conditioned reflex theory as elaborated by Pavlov, Soviet psychologists have worked out a system of didactics which are strict and fixed in their conception and application. One might even use the term narrow to distinguish them from the broad scope of methods employed, for example, in most US schools.
This is the system the social engineers envisioned and strived for when they slowly rebuilt public education in the West. They desired a system where citizens were conditioned to accept authority and to think of the needs of society, in other words, the state, for the needs of the individual. John Dewey is known as the father of the progressive education movement for his role in ushering in a new paradigm in education. In the December 1943 issue of their self-published magazine, Progressive Education, the board of the Progressive Education Association printed an article discussing a meeting in Chicago the previous month with the following statement.
"We are writing now the credo by which our children must live. Your board unanimously proposes a broadening of the interests and program of this association to include the communities in which our children live. Yes, something happened around a table in Chicago, an organization which might have become mellowed with the years to futility in 3 short days again drew a blueprint for the children of the world."
The education paradigm advocated by John Dewey and funded by foundations such as Rockefeller and Carnegie were based on the behaviorist techniques of Pavlov, which were expanded and elaborated upon by B.F. Skinner.
We are now at the year 1908, which was the year that the Carnegie began operations. And in that year, the trustees, meeting for the first time, raised a specific question, which they discussed throughout the balance of the year in a very learned fashion. And the question is there any means known more effective than war, assuming you wish to alter the life of an entire people? And they conclude that no more effective means than war to that end is known to humanity. So then in 1909 they raised the second question and discussed it, namely, how do we involve the United States in a war? Well, I doubt at that time if there was any subject more removed from the thinking of most of the people of this country than its involvement in a war. There were intermittent shows in the Balkans, but I doubt very much if many people even knew where the Balkans was. Then finally, they answer that question as follows. We must control the State Department. And then that very naturally raises the question of How do we do that? And they answer it by saying, we must take over and control the diplomatic machinery of this country. And finally, they resolve to aim at that as an objective.